All right, hopping over to the East, Georgia and Mississippi State. This game has a lot more interest this week than we thought it would, based on our predictions from the LSU Mississippi State game last week. Miss State coming in this game with a ton of momentum. But does it favor Georgia that they got their big momentum win 2 weeks ago and they got their tune-up game against Samford last week? I think that's a good kind of way to sort of get us into this game.
Yeah, it is interesting that Georgia had a bit of a tune-up. They cruised pretty readily against Stanford. Mississippi State had tune-ups early. Charleston Southern, Louisiana Tech struggled a little bit early in the Louisiana Tech game, but that kind of happens sometimes, right? We don't always come out of the gate all guns blazing. But Mississippi State showed up this week, played really, solid defense, didn't let LSU get much going on the ground, and next thing we know is 37-7. Here's kind of the rub to me, and I'll kind of cut to the chase here. Mississippi State's problem last year was not rush defense. Mississippi State problem was defense in general. And they were 88th nationally in yards per carry allowed last year at 4.76. That's improved radically with junior college additions in the front seven, Jeffrey Simmons, the pass rush. But they were worse in pass defense, 98th nationally. Mississippi State is not yet to play a team that has any sort of sophisticated passing attack. Louisiana Tech is not a great team. Charleston Southern's FCS. LSU's passing game is like something you would see out of a high school team. So my curiosity in this game is, as much as they've improved defensively against the run, and again, they were, quite frankly, terrible last year, have they improved enough defensively against the pass to deal with someone that has an actual quarterback? Now, I'm not saying that Fromm or Eason or whoever plays in this game for Georgia is the world's greatest QB, but he's better than Danny Etling. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how Mississippi State handles a team that is not completely one-dimensional.
And with all due respect to Geis, someone who you and I both weren't as high on as the national pundits were, I don't think that LSU's attack, especially without having a threat at quarterback, is going to compare to the rushing attack that they're going to see from Georgia. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is pretty fair to say, particularly because the offensive line for LSU, they do a lot of stuff. We talked about how they're really multiple. A lot of shifts didn't really work or confuse Mississippi State. And yeah, Sony, as good as the backs are, Geis and Williams was more effective than Geis for LSU. Chubb is better, and Michelle may be better.
Yeah, I think so too. I think, and we're starting out sort of bleak for Mississippi State. We'll get to their positives in a second, but I just want to give a little perspective on Mississippi State because now everybody's shot them up number 2 with a bullet in the SEC after a really impressive win against LSU. No taking away from them on that. We called it wrong. They showed us up. I just want people to understand that, and you've said this before, Georgia's kind of a sleeping giant. I mean, they've recruited well. They've got talent at the skill positions. They've got speed and athleticism. They showed it at Notre Dame. I think after last weekend, that Notre Dame game is actually looking – that Notre Dame win on the road is actually looking like a pretty good win for Georgia. We're talking about going into that game, okay, Georgia's going to beat a team that was 4-8 last year, but it might be that Georgia just beat a team that wins 9 or 10 this year. Is that another fair statement?
I think it is. I'm not sold that Notre Dame is necessarily a 9 or 10 win team, but we both came out of that game saying Notre Dame is not going to be 4-8 this year. And what was more important to me watching Georgia against Notre Dame, like you said, I thought they were capable of being a lot better than they were. They missed a lot of opportunities. Ridley did not play in that game, and they were kind of out of sorts. They dropped balls from through what probably should have been a touchdown pass at one point. They had a false start to move them out of. We talked about there's a series where threw a post that probably should have been caught for a touchdown. Then they had a false start. Then they had a rush for like a 3-yard gain. Then they threw a screen pass and the running back slipped. They didn't do any of that, and they probably score on one of those drives. That was in the third quarter. Georgia has the potential to be a radically better team than they were, and they still beat Notre Dame despite the fact that I thought they played quite poorly. Now that Godwin seems to be really turning it on, they get Ridley back. Some of the younger receivers are starting to come on. They're looking like a much more dynamic offense. I don't know that the offensive line is really dominant, but they're serviceably good. The quarterback Fromm is getting more comfortable game by game. We don't know where Eason is. As far as I'm aware, no one knows where he's at in terms of recovery. And as far as I know, he could start in this game out of the blue. But I think Georgia has the potential to be much better offensively than they have been. And I think defensively, they're easily the most talented team in the SEC East, one of the most talented teams in the SEC. Georgia, if they get everything in line, is a very, very good football team. And I'm starting to think by the end of the season, Georgia is going to may well be one of the better teams in the country.
There's one thing that's given me pause about jumping on the Georgia train, and it's the thing that benefited Miss State last week and almost got Notre Dame the win against Georgia. Last week against LSU, Miss State inherited or faced a team that had 9 penalties for 112 yards and that really slowed their momentum and played into Mississippi State's hands, sort of as that extra sort of defender in that scenario. So Georgia is a team that's known for not being really disciplined, for making silly mistakes, for dropping passes and falling down and having a lot of penalties. Is that something that could play into Mississippi State's hands and kind of give them an advantage? Let's assume Georgia hasn't hit their stride yet. Could Mississippi State steal one because Georgia's still not there yet on the discipline side of things?
I think they absolutely could. If you watched a lot of that LSU Mississippi State game, something that really stuck out to me, we talked about this a lot. One, Mississippi State was able to run the ball well enough to keep LSU aggressive, attacking the line of scrimmage because they kind of had to slow the run game. But Mississippi State's points mainly came by catching LSU badly out of position. We talked a lot about our preview show about how Mississippi State used Keith Mixon, who is 5'8", not a traditional receiver, basically to exploit problems in coverage. Again, like you've said in other shows, if you haven't seen that and you're curious about it, we talked a lot about the LSU Mississippi State game right at the start of our preview show. If you're a Mississippi State fan and you're curious, you can kind of check that out, or a Georgia fan too, to hear our thought on that. I'll try not to repeat that too much. So Georgia, it doesn't matter how good or talented you are if you're out of position. And in fact, one of the old coaching sayings I always heard is, smart speed will kill you, and smart speed is deadly. Stupid speed just runs away from the ball faster. So if you've got really great athletes and they can cover a lot of ground, that's fine and wonderful. But if they're running the wrong direction, then it just means you look even worse when they're out of position. Now, I don't think Georgia is necessarily super susceptible to that defensively, though they probably are a little bit. And they have been, honestly, traditionally, and they were that way under Rick. But I think a lot of the concern here is, are they able to, generate enough rush by Mississippi State to put them out of position in the first place? And I know it sounds like I'm making a turn here, but the LSU game and all those mistakes that Mississippi State was able to capitalize on was because they were running for 6 yards a carry. And the LSU safeties and linebackers were trying to crash the line of scrimmage. If Georgia can control the line of scrimmage with their front seven, if Trenton Thompson and Roquan Smith and Lorenzo Carter are getting disruption in what is a very zone read based heavy scheme, if they're able to bottle up Nick Fitzgerald, because they do have the outside linebackers with the speed and athleticism to do so, that means Mississippi State has to play them straight up. And suddenly it becomes less about taking advantage of the lack of discipline by Georgia, and then they have to use guys like Keith Mixon as a traditional receiver in a traditional route tree, and I think things become radically harder.
Okay, this is not fair to Georgia fans and not fair in terms of observation for Georgia, but because they've faced so few really good quarterbacks under Kirby Smart, I want to ask two questions, really. One, is this the second best quarterback that Georgia's seen in the last, let's say, year and a half? And two, can we glean anything from what we saw last year in the one game against a really good quarterback in Chad Kelly, where they gave up 11.8 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns, and lost 45-14? Is that another thing that we can put in Mississippi State's favor as having a dynamic quarterback that might give them sort of that shot at the win?
Well, they did beat the great Mitch Mitchell, however you want to say it, Trubisky last year, right in the opener. So I'll give him that. I think you're right. This is probably the second best quarterback. I mean, he's probably not quite as good as James Franklin III. Um, okay, there's a little tongue in cheek there, but no, I think it's a fair question, right? If you their lack of skilled passers they've played has prevented them from really being exposed or strained as a defense. They've been able to be very, very aggressive and attacking, and they've still given up a lot of points in a lot of ball games the past 2 years. But that said, this is gonna be kind of a strange argument. That Ole Miss game was a disaster on both sides of the football last year, right? I mean, defensively it was bad, offensively it was bad, and we talked a lot about how early in the year when they were healthy, Chad Kelly was a flippin' first round draft pick, and he had elite 5-star receivers on the edge. They had a good offensive line, and they could light anybody up. I mean, they had a phenomenal tight end that's going to start in the NFL. They were just an awesome offense when they were clicking. But Georgia's disruptive linebackers, guys like Lorenzo Carter, who almost single-handedly took over the game against Notre Dame, right? Mean that Georgia can get a lot of pressure and disruption, I think, and generate a real pass rush. And it may well be that as much as we're saying that Georgia hasn't been tested by a better passer, it may also be that Georgia hasn't had a chance to shine. And I'm usually the Grim Reaper on this show, and I'm being very positive about that, but I think it's kind of true. Georgia is more athletic and disruptive than they are big or have been recently. Again, we've talked a lot about Carter. Carter's struggles, if anything, have been he's not always physical enough to handle the point. That's why they lost to Florida last year. Florida played Neanderthal offense and just banged on them until they got their way. I think actually, and strangely, they may be better off playing against somebody that relies on their arm a lot more. And as much as Mississippi State is a physical offense, and they are, it's a little more finesse than that. And I don't know that anybody in the SEC East really runs the kind of finesse spread offense that Mississippi State runs right now. And I think the athleticism and disruption that Georgia can generate actually could be a pretty good factor because of that.
If we're looking at sort of carrying a little further with what you were just talking about, if we're looking at I think it's pretty obvious, at least in terms of recruiting rankings, that you've got more talent and more depth on Georgia's side. If we're looking at the Georgia offense, do they have the players, the depth, and the talent to play that kind of grinding football and just wear out Mississippi State's defense that probably lacks the depth but is playing better this year on the front line, just wear them out by the fourth quarter and be able to run it for 6-7 yards a carry for the last 10 minutes of the game?
I think that's more of an open question. It does look like Mississippi State's front seven has greatly improved. There's a lot of talk about Simmons. I think that's fair. Simmons is really helped change the nature of that defense by coming on this year. But I think you are kind of onto something in that as much as Mississippi State does look good, like in that LSU game, we talked also about the fact that LSU didn't run 56 plays in that ball game. They never really got the chance to wear Mississippi State out, and LSU actually had a lot of success. They had 2 long drives at the end of that ball game once Mississippi State started getting tired. So if Georgia can get some 3 and outs from Mississippi State, which means they get the ball longer and sort of sustain drives over the course of the game, I do think there's merit to the idea that at some point that new, young, oncoming talent, the Simmons and Adams and Thomas and Sweat that have really made Mississippi State's defense turn a corner, those guys may get worn down. And when the backups come in, much like we saw in 2014 when Mississippi State was good and made a run, the lack of depth was pretty stark. And in that year, I forget the statistics, but it was like the starters had never gave up a rushing touchdown, and the backups had given up like 9. The drop off was just catastrophic once the starters had to rotate out. So I do think there's a lot of truth to that argument that if Georgia can kind of wear on them and apply their depth, then I think they can kind of wear down that, that starting defensive group by Mississippi State that's so improved, and they can force Mississippi State to rotate in those reserve players that struggled so much last year, some of them that have been, rotated off the starting line or just are reserve players in general, and they can maybe start generating some stuff. So it's going to be interesting to see how all that turns out.
Okay, anything else in this before we do some scores?
I don't really think so. It's to me a litmus test for both teams. This is a big reason why we don't do statistics at this point, because usually right around this time, everybody finished the cupcakes and week 4 hits and bang, we've got a few conference games that gives everybody a chance to really show who and what they are. And I think as much as this is 1 week and we've already played 3, we will learn more about both teams this week than we learned in the 3 weeks prior.
All right, let's do this because it's been fun doing this so far. So let's do it one more time. If Georgia wins this game, who's the MVP? And if Mississippi State wins, is the MVP Fitzgerald?
All right, first question. If Georgia wins, who's the MVP?
Mm-hmm.
I think if Georgia wins this game, the MVP is probably going to be Fromm, because I think they're going to have to generate a passing game. It could be Chubb. It could be Chubb who just wears them down and runs it over them late. It's kind of two ways to think about it, right? Let me flip this on you and say, if Fromm is the MVP, they win. Like if Fromm plays at an MVP level such that he would be in consideration for it, then they have won the game. Because if Fromm plays at that level, they're going to be able to strain Mississippi State too much, I think. But I think it's about a 50-50 shot. Otherwise, if Fromm is the one that scores the points, or Fromm does enough to keep them honest, where Chubb could score the points, even though Fromm played at a high enough level to make Chubb do it. But either way, I think Fromm is the guy that has to key the victory.
And if Miss State wins?
If Miss State wins, I don't see any way it can be anybody but Fitzgerald. He's going to have to both strain Georgia enough running the ball to make them crash up to the line of scrimmage, and he absolutely has to capitalize in the passing game.
All right, give me your score. Give me your winner. Give me your score.
All right. I do think Georgia takes this one. I think they're too much for Mississippi State, and I think this one, as we see a lot of times, everybody likes to pick close scores because they don't want to seem wrong, and they always feel like it's going to be a close game, so they pick a close score. We try not to do that and actually guess what the score really will be. I think this is going to be a score that's a lot larger than the actual difficulty of the game. I think Georgia wins something like 34-17. I think the game is close through about 3 quarters. And then, like you said, I think Mississippi State starts wearing down, and the pass rush starts getting to Nick Fitzgerald, and they force a couple negative plays, and Georgia starts being able to lean on the depth of Mississippi State and generate chunks in the run game, which opens everything up, and they pull away late.
So this is interesting because for people that have watched this show for the last year and a half, they know that you and I generally don't deviate. We usually pick the same team, and then our deviation comes in the point spreads. I'm picking a different team. I'm going Miss State in this one, partially because I think Miss State is that good, and partially because I don't think Georgia has got all the discipline stuff sorted out yet. And I think Mississippi State is good enough to take advantage of the sloppiness that they're going to see from Georgia, and especially if Fromm is still in there. I know he played, 1 game one kind of big time game against Notre Dame, but Notre Dame's offense is not as good as Mississippi State's offense. Wimbush is not as good as Nick Fitzgerald, in my opinion. I think Miss State's going to be able to run it a little bit. I think they're going to throw it a little bit. And I think they win by 10. I think it's 27-17 Miss State, and I've got Fitzgerald as the MVP, and if Georgia wins, I've got a Sony Michel, Nick Chubb combo if Georgia wins that game. So any thoughts on us completely going in different directions? Is it that one of us is just reading it wrong, or are we still in that it's too early to know that much about any team just yet?
Well, I think it is just too early. We have one game sample for Georgia where they frankly looked bad, but better than the other team in a win over Notre Dame. And we have a one game sample for Mississippi State where they pummeled an LSU team that looked completely out of sorts. I will say this though, and I do mean it. I am the Grim Reaper on this show, and I was harsh last year on Georgia. I think if Georgia wins this game against Mississippi State, I think they probably go 11-1. I think they're going to drop one at some point late in the year, but they're probably an 11-win team if they can win this game, like I think they will, given the fact that they play Tennessee, Vanderbilt, Missouri, Florida in a row after this. They got a lot of time to improve. South Carolina looks almost to be better than Florida right now, frankly, but Florida, South Carolina, Auburn all come late in the season when they're well rested. They miss LSU, they miss Alabama in the West, and that schedule sets up nicely for them to have a really good season. If they lose,
based on what you said about Georgia, as opposed to like we were talking about South Carolina earlier, I think you think they're a good team, and not because they're skirting a tough schedule, but they're just actually have the potential to be a really good team.
I do, and I'm with you that I don't think they're necessarily that great of a team right now. They're not operating at that level. A lot of my score comes from the fact that I think the Mississippi State LSU game was a little bit of a mirage based on LSU being a team that is coached by a Neanderthal that did not in any way properly scheme or deal with what the opponent was doing, and Mississippi State did, and LSU was caught completely, basically with their pants down. And I'm just not quite buying Mississippi State yet. And it made that really until they prove it to me. And I think that's kind of fair based off past results.
And Miss State fans will say that 37-7 should have proven it to you. But anyway.
Well, you know, it's not me ragging on Miss State. I mean, it's kind of odd for me it's me hating on Miss State because I don't think very much of LSU, which isn't fair to Mississippi State, but that just kind of is what it is.
Okay, so I think that wraps it up for these two teams. Looking at this week, when I was back in week 1, I didn't have a lot of hopes for week 4. I was trying to figure out what games we were going to talk about. And now, lo and behold, we've got something that's really interesting. And I bet CBS wishes they had this one and not Alabama Vanderbilt. So, y'all, that's it for this week. We ran a little long, but we had a lot to talk about, surprisingly. As always, we want to hear your score predictions in the comments. Let us know where we're wrong in the comments. Let us know how awesome we are in the comments. Give us a thumbs up if you like it, thumbs down if you didn't, and a subscribe either way. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.